Chapter 8. From Religious Sacrifice to Eroticism. Christianity and the sacred nature of transgression misunderstood. In the introduction, I discussed the similarity perceived by man in ancient times between the act of love and sacrifice. They felt the immediacy of sacrifice more strongly than we do, for we never perform a sacrifice. The sacrifice of the Mass is a reminder, but it only really makes a deep impression on our sensibility. However obsessive we find the symbol of the cross, the Mass is not readily identified with the bloody sacrifice. The main difficulty is that Christianity finds law-breaking repugnant in general. True, the Gospels encourage the breaking of laws adhered to by the letter when their spirit is absent. But then, the law is broken because its validity is questioned, not in spite of its validity. Essentially, in the idea of the sacrifice upon the cross, the very character of transgression has been altered. That sacrifice is a murder, of course, and a bloody one. It is a transgression in the sense that it is, of course, a sin, and of all sins indeed the gravest. But in transgression, as I have described it, sin, if sin there is, and expiation, if expiation there is, are the consequence of a resolute and intentional act. The intentional nature of the act is what makes the primitive attitude hard for us to understand. Our thinking is outraged. The idea of deliberately transgressing the law, which seems holy, makes us uneasy. But the sin of the crucifixion is disallowed by the priest celebrating the sacrifice of Mass. The fault lies in the blindness of the authors of the deed, and we are bound to think that they would not have committed it if only they had known. True, the Church sings Felix culpa, happy fault. So there is a point of view which accepts the necessity of the deed. The echoing liturgy is in harmony with the deeps of primitive human thought. It strikes a false note in the logic of Christian feeling. Misunderstanding the sanctity of transgression is one of the foundations of Christianity. Even if, at its peaks, men under vows reach the unthinkable paradoxes that set them free, that overreach all bounds. The ancient comparison of sacrifice and erotic intercourse. The harmony perceived by men of old has been made meaningless by this failure to grasp the nature of transgression. If transgression is not fundamental, then sacrifice and the act of love have nothing in common. If it is an intentional transgression, sacrifice is a deliberate act, whose purpose is a sudden change in the victim. The creature is put to death. Before that, it was enclosed in its individual separateness, and its existence was discontinuous, as I said in the introduction. But this being is brought back by death into continuity with all being, to the absence of separate individualities. The act of violence that deprives the creature of its limited particularity and bestows on it the limitless, infinite nature of sacred things is, with its profound logic, an intentional one. It is intentional like the act of the man who lays bare, desires, and wants to penetrate his victim. The lover strips the beloved of her identity no less than the blood-stained priest his human or animal victim. The woman in the hands of her assailant is despoiled of her being. With her modesty she loses the firm barrier that once separated her from others and made her impenetrable. She is brusquely laid open to the violence of the sexual urges set loose in the organs of reproduction. She is laid open to the impersonal violence that overwhelms her from without. Doubtless, early men would hardly have been able to expound an analysis in detail. Only familiarity with large-scale thinking on the subject has made that possible since. The original experience and the development of numerous threads are both necessary if the similarities between two profound experiences are to be accurately mapped out. But the inner experience of piety and sacrifice, and in untrammeled eroticism might by chance befall one person. That would make possible, if not a clear analogy, at least a feeling that there was a resemblance. This possibility vanished with Christianity, where piety eschewed the desire to use violent means to probe the secrets of existence. The flesh in sacrifice and in love. The external violence of the sacrifice reveals the internal violence of the creature, seen as loss of blood and ejaculations. The blood in the organs brimful of life were not what modern anatomy would see. The feeling of the men of old can only be recaptured by an inner experience, not by science. We may presume that they saw the fullness of their blood-swollen organs, the impersonal fullness of life itself. The individual discontinuous existence of the animal was succeeded in its death by the organic continuity of life drawn into the common life of the beholders by the sacrificial feast. There remains something slightly bestial about consuming this meat in the atmosphere of surging carnal life and the silence of death. Now the only meat we eat is prepared for the purpose, inanimate, removed from the organic seething of life where it made its first appearance. The sacrifice links the act of eating with the truth of life revealed in death. It is the common business of sacrifice to bring life and death into harmony, to give death the upsurge of life, life the momentousness, and the vertigo of death opening onto the unknown. Here life is mingled with death, but simultaneously death is a sign of life, a way into the infinite. Nowadays, sacrifices outside the field of our experience and imagination must do duty for the real thing. But even if sacrifice and its religious meaning escape us, we cannot fail to know the reactions concerned with certain elements in the spectacle, namely nausea. We have to imagine a sacrifice as something beyond nausea. But if the divine transfiguration does not take place, taken separately, the different aspects may finally induce a feeling of nausea. Cattle being slaughtered or cut up often makes people sick today, but there is nothing in the dishes served at tables to remind them of this, so one might say of contemporary experience that it inverts pious conduct and sacrifice. This inversion is meaningful if we now consider the similarity between the act of love and the sacrifice. Both reveal the flesh. Sacrifice replaces the ordered life of the animal with a blind convulsion of its organs. So, also with the erotic convulsion. It gives free rein to extravagant organs whose blind activity goes on beyond the considered will of the lovers. Their considered will is followed by the animal activity of these swollen organs. They are animated by the violence outside the control of reason, swollen to bursting point, and suddenly the heart rejoices to yield to the breaking of the storm. The urges of the flesh pass all bounds in the absence of controlling will. Flesh is the extravagance within us set up against the law of decency. Flesh is the born enemy of people haunted by Christian taboos. But if, as I believe, an indefinite and general taboo does exist, opposed to sexual liberty in ways depending on the time and the place, the flesh signifies a return to this threatening freedom. The flesh, decency, and the taboo on sexual freedom. When I first discussed the general taboo on sexual activity, I evaded the issue, being unable or unwilling to define it. Truth to tell, in that it is never easy to discuss, it defies definition. Decency is a chance matter of time and place, and standards vary continually, even with individuals. That is why I have confined myself to taboos that could be defined, connected with incest or menstruation, and have postponed consideration of the more general malediction attached to sexuality. I shall not turn my attention to this until later, and I shall examine the transgressions of this amorphous taboo before I try to define it. First, I should like to go back some way. If a taboo exists, it is a taboo on some elemental violence, to my thinking. This violence belongs to the flesh responsible for the urges of the organs of reproduction. Through an objective consideration of the activity of these organs, I shall try to get at the fundamental inner experience transcending the flesh. I want first to turn your attention to the inner experience of the plethora which I said was revealed in the depth of the sacrificial victim. Underlying eroticism is the feeling of something bursting, of the violence accompanying an explosion.